everyone, and welcome to the San Francisco Opera Guild's virtual preview of Wagner's Parsifal. I'm Lauren Erickson, San Francisco Opera Guild board member, and we're thrilled to welcome back one of our absolute favorite presenters, Professor Simon Williams. Before we jump in, I'd like to share a quick information about the San Francisco Opera Guild and our mission. We were in 1939, and while we are technically a separate nonprofit organization from the San Francisco Opera Association, many of our programs are in support of the opera, including these opera previews. But our primary commitment is to bring quality education and arts engagement programs to schools and the community. I encourage you to learn more about the Guild's work by visiting us at sfoperaguild.com. Now on to our main event. Professor Simon Williams, Emeritus Professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an active director of both opera and spoken drama, is internationally recognized as an authority on the history of acting and Shakespearean performance, on opera as drama, and on the history of operatic staging. He has lectured worldwide on Wagner, served for several years as lecturer for English-speaking audiences at the Bayreuth Festival, and has spoken on a wide range of operas at both opera houses and opera guilds worldwide. He has authored 4 books on German theater, 2 of them on Wagner, as well as serving as co-editor of the first English language history of German theater, chief editor of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Stage Actors and Acting, and co-editor of the now published Cambridge Encyclopedia of Stage Directors and Directing. Simon's discussion today is chock full of information, so we are going to hop right to it. I hate to admit that I am not very well versed in this opera, and that is embarrassing to admit as an opera lover. All I know is that this opera is very long and that it was his last opera, and that's it. So I am really excited to dive in and learn. So Simon, welcome, and please take it away.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this talk about Parsifal. Well, let's just begin at the beginning with the opening music of Parsifal. Well, very few opera openings are as evocative as this, but what it evokes is uncertain and indeed quite mysterious. It's not a vigorous opening, it's quite placid. It's not entirely of this world, but of far distant places. It doesn't suggest action, but it has at least the aspirations toward peace and almost thinks it might be sleep as well. It is also profoundly beautiful. In fact, I think one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written. And that actually applies for the whole 5-hour expand of the opera. And it also contains drama. The first statement of the theme is plain. It's carried just by the strings with minimal support from the woodwinds. And then the second statement of the theme is carried by the high brass. It has a tone of stress. It has a touch of hysteria, as if the composer is both fascinated by the vision suggested by the theme and yet afraid of it at the same time. Lohengrin and Tristan and Isolde, even Das Rheingold, have begun quietly in the depths of the earth, or in undefined space, or in the unconscious mind of some character. But Parsifal also includes a sense of an ending and intense seriousness. It is both comforting and distressing. In fact, the duality of response which one can have to that first statement of the major theme, one of the major themes of Parsifal, is that duality of response is a constant presence in the opera. We love something, but are we entirely sure we have a good understanding of what it is? Now, first, let's get down to some facts. First, the chronology of the composition of Parsifal. Wagner knew that Parsifal was going to be his last work, but actually he conceived of it really quite early in his career. He first read the story of Parsifal in the epic poem by Wolfgang von Eschenbach, a translation of which was very popular in Germany at his time. He read that in 1841 when he was taking the waters at Marienbad. This must have been very good waters because he also conceived of Lohengrin and Die Meistersinger at the same time during his stay in Marienbad. Next, we hear about Parsifal about 12 years later in the Good Friday vision, in which Wagner, who was living at this time in a hut or little cottage on the estate of the Wesendonck family, said that he came out one morning and he looked at the wonderful world of nature around him, at the lake in the distance and the mountains beyond it, and everything was alive and full of energy. And he said that this is my Good Friday vision, which will be a strong element in Parsifal when eventually it was written. Of course, this has been discussed a lot of time, a lot. Many people say, well, he wasn't actually in Zurich on Good Friday, but it doesn't really matter. What does matter is he got this idea of a great sort of, a wonderful, tremendous vision of nature and life and energy. In 1865, he wrote a prose draft of the plot and extensive notes. This is while he was in Munich preparing for the performance of Tristan and Isolde, but he didn't go any further than the draft and the notes. But then in 1877, after he had completed the first performance of the Ring, or supervised the first complete performance of the Ring, he then sat down and wrote the whole draft, and the final draft of the poem for Parsifal was completed in Bayreuth in 1877. And then from 1877 through to 1882, he composed the score, both in Bayreuth and in Palermo. Wagner was greatly in love with the climate of southern Italy and of Sicily. Like many Germans, he preferred Italy to the rather damp and foggy climate that he was often forced to live in. But anyway, the score was finished, and it was premiered sorry, I beg your pardon. It was premiered at the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, the festival theatre, in 1882, and he called the play a Bühnenweih Festspiel, meaning this is a play that is devoted to consecrating a stage. Rather an awkward title. He couldn't actually call it exactly a sort of a tragedy or a comedy, but he got out of really committing to exactly what genre he was using. And then the first legitimate performance of Parsifal only took place several years later outside Bayreuth in Bologna, in Italy. And immediately after this, it was followed by performances in many other parts of Europe, in London and in other German cities as well. The reason for this was that the Wagner family had really insisted that Parsifal should only be performed at Bayreuth because it had been composed for the particular the particular acoustic of the Bayreuth auditorium. And however, lots of theatres would like to have performed it. And in fact, it was performed briefly in New York because the USA didn't actually subscribe to certain copyright rules. This was in 1911. And Cosima, his wife, Wagner's wife, was so furious, she said, nobody who performed in that performance in New York can ever perform at Bayreuth. And she got her way as well. Now, the one other thing is that this is the first time a performance in Bayreuth actually made money, ran a profit. There was unprecedented audience interest. In fact, the work really caught the spiritual atmosphere of the time. And after this, it was always in the repertoire. Now, Parsifal. Let's talk. Oh, I just have a picture here of the Grail scenes in Acts 1 and 3. Now, first, the plot of Parsifal. I've been asked if I could just give you an idea of what happens. Well, it's actually not that complex a plot, but what that plot means is a different matter. First, it's set in Montsalvat, which is a castle in the Pyrenees, those mountains between Spain and France, very beautiful, haunting mountains. And in the castle, we have is embodied the temple of the Grail. The Grail, which is the chalice with which Joseph of Arimathea caught the blood that went from the wound in Christ's side when he was being crucified. It also houses, the Montsalvat houses, a body of knights who worship in the Temple of the Grail and sort of keep the Grail as the center of their devotion. And they go out in the world to bring light and salvation, to restore a benighted population. In other words, there is light and energy that comes from the Grail in Montsalvat that is then spread by the knights throughout the world to whoever will hear them. But there are problems. In the past, the king, Amfortas, went out and was wounded in a battle. And he is suffering from a terrible wound that will not heal. As a result, the Brotherhood of the Grail are beginning to lose all energy and lives themselves. Now, Act 1. The time of the action is indeterminate, but maybe think of it basically as being the Middle Ages. The opera begins with an old knight, gentleman named Gurnemanz, who is telling younger knights who are being recruited into the Brotherhood of the Veil, the reasons for the decay of Mont Salvat. And I would suggest to you all, if you are not too familiar with Parsifal, to actually listen quite closely for the first 20 to 25 minutes, because Gornemans gives a very detailed sort of account, backstory of what happened, everything that we're going to be seeing on the stage. But anyway, he tells us the reason for the decline of the Brotherhood is Amfortas, the Grail King. When he went out to fight that battle, actually he encountered a woman of terrible beauty, and he was seduced by her, and he made love to her, thus breaking the vow of chastity that binds the knights. While he was doing this, Klingzor, a fallen knight, who is actually a lord of the magic castle in which Parsifal is I beg your pardon, Amfortas is. This is a castle given to earthly delights. And Klingzor saw Amfortas and the woman of terrible beauty making love. He grasps Amfortas's spear and wounds him with it. He stabs him. Now, the wound will not heal. And so every day, Amfortas lives in agony as he is trying to treat this terrible wound. Kundry, a wild woman who, I won't may as well give away the secret now, actually was also the woman who seduced Amfortas. And by the way, she also lived for 2,000 years. So you know that we're in the world to a consumer. Here we are in the world of fantasy and of symbolic action rather than real action. But she rushes on in the first act with medicines for Amfortas. At the same time, a procession enters that takes Amfortas to a lake for a healing bath. Amfortas is in constant agony. And as all these events sort of gradually come together, Gornemans tells the young knights to whom he is speaking that everything will be solved when a fool, enlightened by compassion, visits the Brotherhood and indeed will bring to it the end to its peace and suffering. Now, at this point, a young man, in fact, I'll tell you, he is Parsifal. You won't find it. He doesn't really know his name though until Act 2. He comes rushing on, and Parsifal is at this point a wild young man. And he comes on, and there's tremendous distress everywhere because he has just shot a swan, and it is fallen to the ground and has given great anguish to Amfortas. Here is that scene.
Der König grüßt ihn als gutes Zeichen, als über dem See kreiste der Schwan, da flog ein Bein. Der war sehr schoss dieser Morgen, der Falken seinen gleich. Bist du's, der diesen Schwan erlegte? Der Fisch, im Flote trefflich, was fliegt? Du tatest das und bangtest dich nicht vor der Tat.
The Gornemans upbraids this young man for his carelessness, for his violence and cruelty. And he asks the young man who he is. And the young man says, I don't know. Who is your mother? Who is your father? I don't know. Where are you going? I don't know. In other words, he seems to be completely ignorant of himself and of the world and what his life is going to be. In the middle of this questioning, all are summoned to the unveiling of the Grail in the temple. Only Amfortas can do this, but he does so. And whenever he does it, it causes him terrible agony as his wound reopens and he relives his torment. After the unveiling, the knights who have all gathered round and sung a very, very powerful chorus, the knights march out refreshed by the sight of the Grail, and we can interpret, I think, also filled with the energies that the Grail communicates to them. Gornemans and the young man, Parsifal, are just left on the stage, and Gornemans asks Parsifal, have you understood anything that's happened? And Parsifal says, no, and he's kicked out. Act 2 takes place several years later. Probably we see in Act 1 Parsifal as a young boy, as a youth, in his teens, whereas now we have him as a man, both maybe sort of maybe somebody at the beginning of his middle age, but mature, and he knows the world quite well, we suppose. But he still does not seem to have had much experience in terms of sex. In his wandering through the world, he arrives at Klingsor's castle, a realm of sexual indulgence. Klingsor instructs Kundry, who was both in the woman in the Montserrat in Act 1, but also the terribly beautiful woman who seduced Amfortas. Klingsor instructs Kundry to seduce Parsifal. Parsifal is received by a bevy of flower maidens whose advances Parsifal is supposed to respond to, but he doesn't. In fact, quite frankly, he sort of seems to be a little bit sort of embarrassed and not particularly at ease with them. Well, quite clearly, Kundry is a much more challenging prospect than the Flower Maidens. And indeed, she woos Parsifal to the point where the couple engage in passionate embrace. And it appears that they're just about to really sort of get things going. And then suddenly Parsifal breaks away. He's in agony and he calls out Amfortas's name. And now he says he knows the agony that Amfortas suffers. Now he understands what he saw in the first act. And he now says he will not engage in sex with Kundry any longer. Kundry pleads with him for more sex, but he denies it. And then in fury, she calls on Klingsor to destroy Parsifal. Klingsor then attacks Parsifal. He has Amfortas's spear, and he throws the spear at Parsifal, but the spear stops above Parsifal's head. He reaches up, grabs it down, and then sort of waves at the castle. The whole castle collapses, and he leaves, and he says to Kundry, "You know where you can find me." Well, after Act 3, we've had more years of travel. In fact, Parsifal has had one of the most laborious lives imaginable. It's as if somebody has been endlessly climbing a mountain, more and more exhausted. They get to the top and think they're there, and then they see a higher mountain. And it's almost as if his whole life has been like that. And he comes back to Montsalvat absolutely exhausted.
Erkennst mich wieder in Gram und Not so tief gebeugt? Wie kamst du heut? Woher?
He's greeted by Gornemans and by Kundry, They recognize the holiness that he has achieved in his life. They sanctify him and they baptize him. He declares himself the king of the Grail Brotherhood, and carrying the spear, enters the temple with Gornemans and Kundry. Knights are about to celebrate the last ritual, perhaps the last ritual unveiling ever of the Grail. Amfortas desperately pleads with them not to unveil the Grail, but at the same time, they are all themselves dying. Their energy is going there, is being sapped away. And then Parsifal enters, the perfect fool who has been prophesied. He touches Amfortas with the spear and heals him. Then he gently blesses Kundry, who dies. The knights gather around Parsifal, their new leader among music of ever-increasing exaltation. Now, what do we make of this? The story is probably not too difficult to follow, but what it means is something that has puzzled many people, particularly those who see the opera for the first time. And at the end, with this magnificent music, as Parsifal sort of enters into this sort of transcendental state, we actually say to ourselves, and I remember I did the first time I saw Parsifal, well, what has he done? Why is he given this transcendental state? Well, that's what I want to focus on now. This way, we can get to understand it if we think of Parsifal as taking place on three levels of action. The first is surface reality, the physical world, the world that we are living in every day. The second is the inner world of the unconscious, which we all sort of have within ourselves. It's a much more private world. And the third level is the symbolic level, the universal world that is implied by religious symbols and is expressed mainly by the music itself, because the actual sort of universality is very, very difficult to communicate just in words itself. Now, each of these levels are differently involved in each other. Settings for Parsifal have ranged over a tremendously wide sort of selection of places and approaches. Let me just give you four very recent productions, all of which in some ways focus upon the surface reality, the physical world. Here's a production that was done in Bayreuth in 2005. This was by Stefan Herrheim, a very good director, and this focused upon the biography both of Wagner and of Germany over the sort of about 80 years from Wagner's old age through to the end of the Second World War. It was a tremendously moving production. I didn't see it personally. A DVD was made but was never released commercially, but can be found if you do a little bit of resourceful sort of searching on the internet. It can be set in hospitals. In the Vienna Staatsoper in 2017 did this elaborate production in a famous hospital, Otto Wagner Spital, it was actually not at all well received, I'm sorry to say, because it does look rather splendid. And then there have been productions that are gruesomely realistic, that emphasize poverty, blood, and war, as this production from the Berlin Staatsoper in 2015, at a point where Amfortas is being forced by the knights around him to bless the Grail. Most recently, there's a production of the Glyndebourne Opera in 2025. I never saw this, but it looks as if it's really quite fascinating, as it's sort of set actually in the time of that the opera was written. Critical responses were divided, as they are so often in England. Many productions, though, are broadly symbolic. They have no definite sense of space. The music and the poem shift from one level to another and even can represent different levels simultaneously. The time span seems to cover a lifetime, but actually, one of these productions, the Berlin production that I've shown you a picture from, actually fits it all into a 24-hour time span, and that seemed to work too. So it's a work of sort of rather indefinite sort of borders and dynamics. And the action deals with inner matters. What happens? A boy sees a man in agony, doesn't understand it. The boy is, as a man, is then almost seduced by the woman who caused the other man's anguish. And then at the end, the man, now older, returns to the suffering man's house and he takes over. There's only one major incident in the whole opera, and that is the failed seduction of Act Two. Is that all? Well, there's something very strange about Parsifal. You'll keep on saying to yourself, what's happening? What's going on? But if you stay with it right the way through to the end of the third act, you will feel that the universe has changed, and maybe you have changed with it. It is an incredibly powerful and amusing, an incredible powerful work, due in particular to the music. Now, I'd just like to talk a little bit more about those three levels before I Parsifal and what he stands for. I don't think actually we can get too much from realistic presentations. Much of the plot of Parsifal quite clearly implicates the inner world and the spiritual world. Indeed, we may well say that spirituality is sort of the heart of the opera. This is what its basic theme is. A realistic setting would be limited, particularly because it masks spiritual aspects of the action. Wagner was always a little bit leery about these realistic sort of sets because he kept on saying, well, if people are just taken up with looking at what the thing actually is, at a rock or a table or a chair, they won't see beyond it to the symbolic world, which is ultimately what I'm writing about and what those symbols should lead our imagination toward. In fact, Wagner's comment that now I have invented the invisible orchestra, I think I should go ahead and invent the invisible theater. You'll find that a large number of Wagnerian scholars claim that this is just Wagner having a joke. In fact, I don't think it is. I think he actually really meant what he was saying. The second level, the unconscious. Wagner had pioneered psychological opera with his technique of the leitmotif. Now, in Parsifal, whereas in the Ring, leitmotifs sort of are adapted to fragments, they're melodies denoting objects, places, emotions, people, and they're constantly modulating and changing, and they allow us to understand the basic themes of the action and the dynamics of the mind and emotion. These leitmotifs actually sort of present the meaning of the opera to us. In Parsifal, things are different. There are some very, very clear sort of melodies, leitmotifs, one I played you at the very beginning. But these mainly emanate from religious ideas about the world around us, sometimes from the emotional experiences of the characters when they feel they are not really part of the physical world, but more part of a sort of a metaphysical world. And so they are, and these leitmotifs are often closely associated with characters' emotions. There is one character, Amfortas, who is vividly pain. And he tends to sort of remind us a little bit about characters and about the leitmotifs in the Ring. But he actually is worthy of an opera on his own. Now, there's the symbolic level. This is probably, to my way of thinking, the most promising approach to try to understand what's happening. From the start of the action, we get the sense that everything has been foretold. What we are going to see is the acting out of a truth that has prevailed for eons, a timeless truth. And we find it's repeated and repeated and repeated. And you feel that every time this truth is repeated, you hope that this actually sort of, as it were, lifts the characters to a sort of a state of higher sublimity in the world. The symbols, many symbols are taken from Christianity: the spear that pierced Christ's side, the grail that caught his blood, a dove which appears at scenes at the end. But Wagner was also very familiar with the religions of different parts of the world, with Buddhism in particular, but he was familiar with Islam and with the Judaic religion. He was very skilled in European folklore. Both the Flower Maidens and the idea of the perfect fool come from popular folk drama. He was also very familiar with the work of Schopenhauer and leading thinkers in mystical philosophy. This is a mix, and it's sort of a sense. Wagner, I think, is trying to give a sense of the sort of the world that this whole cultural experience that he has absorbed is what it is composed of. Although some of the music is overtly religious and in particularly Christian, there's no sense of competition between the beliefs. The unity of all things is the essence of Parsifal. The whole action also has the quality of a fable. Characters are playing out symbolic or moral or the mystical meaning of an action, as well as sort of being sort of characters living in this world. As a result, most of the characters actually are two-dimensional. Parsifal, who becomes the savior of the Brotherhood, is we become very much aware of it, particularly as the opera goes on, as to how he is there, as it were, to sort of save the Brotherhood and move the world forward, we hope, to a more peaceful condition. Gurnemantz's marvelous role, which the role, by the way, is the longest in the opera, but Gurnemantz tells us everything there is to know of the past, and we see him there primarily as serving that narrative function. Klingsor is a devil with much of the pantomime and folk play about him, and Kundry, a very strange figure. She has so many wild and different and interesting aspects to her, actually stands for all women whose allure threatens the stability of society, the stability of the males with whom they live. I'm sure all of you, in fact, can imagine very clearly what I am talking about here. But we do get the sense that a lot of these characters stand as much for what they think or what they represent as they do as being itself sort of motivating characters. Now, to Parsifal's journey and growth, some scholars and directors have seen Parsifal as the fifth drama of the Ring. I don't fully agree, but I would like to say that it does serve as a final treatment of a theme that had been obsessing Wagner throughout his early days, and it was that of the hero. He was preoccupied with questions such as, what is a hero? How does a heroic action differentiate itself from ordinary actions? What is the public function of the hero? What stands in the way of heroes fulfilling their function? And I think he was so concerned with this is he was writing in the heroic tradition from the drama of ancient Greece through that of medieval Europe into his own modern time. And at the same time, this idea of a hero who could lead society to greater realms of happiness is one that was being very, very much undermined and threatened in the 19th century because of the growth of an industrial and materialistic society. Heroes have traditionally been there to lead us to victory over our enemies or over the enemies in ourselves. They have also been there, we feel, to create a harmony in a divided world. But we should also remember that heroes acknowledge the freedom of the individual. Heroes communicate the joy of life that life can bring to one. And heroes, I think, very importantly, fold human beings into the natural world of which they are a part. Now, most of Wagner's heroes actually fail in their mission. In operas up to and including The Ring, they mainly fail due to their relationship with women, usually involving sexual desire. There was a very strong belief in Europe at the time, a very rigid idea of marriage, which very much the woman played a negative role. And if you look at a lot of the literature at the time, women who broke the rules of marriage very often came to a sticky end. Indeed, it's amazing how many people in European drama at the time of the 19th century, how many women are killed just for, or die, just to sort of, because they have broken the basic tenets of their society. Wagner, however, never fully embraced the public morality of the time that viewed all sexual congress outside marriage as being vicious and dangerous. Rather, he recognized its legitimacy, its centrality in human existence. And in this, he certainly reflected the liberalizing atmosphere in European theatre and opera at the end of the 19th century. Now, his last three music dramas continue this theme: Tristan and Isolde, Die Meistersinger, and Parsifal. Tristan is the most penetrating exploration of erotic love in opera, and one of the reasons why it found itself difficult times way onto the stage, not only because of the technical difficulty, but because people were rather horrified at the sort of just the centrality of erotic love. It's not something you can contemplate it on its own. Die Meistersinger is, of course, a comedy in which the forces of love and of social convenience somehow tied together, and they are reconciled. Parsifal, however, is a mix of early and late Wagner. It's back in the landscape of knightly culture, similar to that of Lohengrin, but with an accumulated understanding of sexuality. Sex does play a role in Lohengrin. It's a little bit difficult to say exactly how, but it plays a massive role in Parsifal. In fact, Wagner, knowing this would be his last opera, I think was looking back on his life, contemplating his death, and above all, what he wanted to do was to, in Parsifal, to solve the dilemma of the hero and the destructive potential of sexual passion. How could we keep the hero who brings joy to the world and separate that hero from the more oppressive individual's idea of heroism? He can bring joy to the world, and at the same time, be able to incorporate sexuality into the world. Now, Parsifal, as we will hear, is actually the redeemer of the Brotherhood. In Act 1, we see Parsifal as the desire to kill. He's Rousseau's noble savage before nobility appeared. He's ignorant of himself, of his name and parentage. The only thing that where he sort of seems to sort of demonstrate a spontaneous response is when Gouvernements tells him how terrible it is he's killed the swan. And he describes very, very sort of clearly how the swan is dying, the energy is going, and this is wanton destruction. And it is quite clear that Parsifal is infuriated by this because he breaks his spear. And not spear, I'm sorry. He breaks his arrow and he throws the bow and arrow away, indicating that obviously he's got some awareness of what he has done. Act 2 is the crux of the drama. It's the act in which Parsifal grows up. The obligation on the Knights of the Brotherhood is to maintain chastity, which means really practicing sexual congress only within marriage. More broadly, exercising the control over one's mind, body, and emotions. Act 2 begins with the most desolate scene in the whole of Wagner, as Klingsor baits Kundry, commanding her to seduce the young Parsifal who approaches his castle. We hear that Klingsor had actually castrated himself as he could not live with his sexual desires, and that is the worst attempt to find a solution to this problem. Kundry is in torment. We have a landscape of sexual dysfunction. And indeed, the only thing that Klingsor can do is look on. And many people have called him the first, maybe the greatest pornographer in opera. This terrible scene is followed by the encounter between Parsifal and the Flower Maidens, which I've already played you an extract from. Wagner adopts the idiom of French opera comique. These ladies sound trivial and shallow, and this is intentionally so. They're not threats. Their attraction is ephemeral. They're easily dispelled when Kundry calls out Parsifal's name. But we realize that Kundry is a much more powerful sort of force drawing on Parsifal's desires. The love duet that follows interweaves love and suspicion, desire and contempt, delight and threat. It's a real love-hate duet. But the important thing is it's entirely framed as a recreation of lovemaking that led to Parsifal's birth. Kundry had seen Parsifal's mother and father copulate, and she takes on the role of the mother, Herzeleide, and says to Parsifal, surrender to me, feel what it is like when your father, Gamuret, sunk into the body of Herzeleide and conceived you. Think of the joy and the sensuality that he experienced. Sorry about that, just a little bit of a glitch. It's difficult to really believe this, but this moment when Parsifal rejects Kundry is the single moment that we know that justifies his crowning as King of the Grail Brotherhood. This act of denial of satisfaction. Now, why is this? Well, first, Parsifal rejects sex that brings a wound, and he rejects sex that, crucially, sex that arises from the mother, sex with roots in incest. We have to remember at this time that there were playwrights such as Henrik Ibsen, and very soon, sort of psychological researchers like Sigmund Freud, who were very, very much concerned with the connections between the sexual connections between the child and the parent. And almost as if they are actually the sort of the most essential of all forms of connection when you engage in sex. But if one does engage in that sex, one in fact is turning back and embracing one's family. One is not moving on. One is not moving toward a greater freedom and developing a faith in oneself existing outside the protective area of the family. It's a tremendous amount of meaning to put on one single event, but this is the way Wagner has presented to us. But when we don't find from him what is the ideal form of sex, that's something that's only going to have to exist in our minds. But he has certainly rejected sex that involves the imposition of one person on another. He's rejected sex that's a form of conflict. He rejects sex as oppression, as pure sensuality. In all these ways, it is incomplete and ultimately negative. What must happen is all love must be tempered by compassion, by an understanding of the other's humanity. And he learns compassion, and we learn that as he calls out the name of Amfortas, and in fact learns control over the most powerful of his instincts. Now, I just should begin to sort of start wrapping up now, but what I'd like to do is just finish by talking a little bit about the music of Parsifal, which is, as I'm sure several of you are familiar, extraordinarily beautiful. And I refer you to this this reference, internet reference. Derek Everett has written a very, very intelligent and very lucid description of the music of Parsifal. He shows how, in fact, on the whole, leitmotifs are very different than what they were in the Ring. We have to remember that the poem of Parsifal is the shortest in Wagner. The score, however, is one of the longest and harmonically one of the most complex of his operas. It actually stretches the bounds of tonality. And most notably, in this opera, many leitmotifs are similar in orchestration and harmony. There's a constant modulation, but it's not dramatic like it was in The Ring. Nevertheless, it's constantly changing, but with much more subtlety than The Ring. As some scholars have pointed out, the music of Parsifal actually is an embodiment of the idea of eternal and perpetual change. And we, of course, have to live within that whole landscape of change. In fact, I find the most notable music in Parsifal is the ambient music. It's music not necessarily that sort of pushes the action forward, but music that sort of occupies our mind. If you hear Parsifal and Bayreuth, it's an incredible experience because suddenly the music seems to come from nowhere and plant itself in your mind. When you leave the theatre at the end, you will find that the music comes with you almost as if it is a presence. Other people have expressed the sort of the presence of music in Parsifal as being music is itself a character. This ambient music establishes atmosphere. It describes states of mind, being, emotion, rather than actions. Musicologists actually tell us that all the music has its origins in the opening bars that I played you at the beginning of my talk. Now, I won't replay that, but certainly those opening bars set the atmosphere, and we're going to hear them again throughout the time. But every time you hear that opening theme, it intensifies the sense of depth and distance, and it builds the sonic world of the opera. And also, it's different almost every time. So while a lot of the music in Parsifal is the same, when you listen to it closely, it is quite one of the most stimulating and exciting experiences we can have in the opera house. In fact, it is the quality of orchestral sound, the a rather high tessitura in the entire opera, the entire score. Those themes that refer to the divine, which is that which, when we eventually achieve what Parsifal achieved, we will get a sense that we actually belong to the divine. Now, I'd just like to finish by playing 3 short extracts that gives you some idea of how we move towards this exalted state at the end. The anguished passages in Act 3 are incredible, especially there's a terror. The brotherhood is terrified of dying, and the terror of death is very clearly communicated. But a lot of his music is actually among the most beautiful music that Wagner ever wrote. The action of the first part of Act 3 is preparing Parsifal for sanctification and then the actual baptism. And you find the music gains in strength as the act advances. Here we have a moment. We take it up from the extract that I played from the third act. We take it up from the end of there, and we have a moment where Parsifal returns and is greeted by cornements, and he expresses his anguish. But as we go on, we find the music gradually changing to a sense of spectacle, a sense of victory and power.
Ach, zu wem den Weg du suchest, zu ich steh staunend, feins vernah, wem nun ich heut zu bringen, mich auserlesen können darf. Doch, ach, den Weg des Heiles nie zu finden, in vaterlosen Irren trieb ein wilder Fluch mich umher. Zahllose Nöte, Kämpfe und Streite zwangen mich ab vom Pfade, fänd ich in Recht oder Hand. Da musste mich der Teufel umfassen, Verschaltung beheil mir zu bergen, das zu hüten, das zu wahren. Ich führen im Streite. Moment weit führ ich ihn mir zur Seite, bin nun ich heimgeleite, der Port hier schimmert heil und hell, es strahles heilgen Speer.
This is followed by the baptizing of Parsifal. But you will notice, by the way, that we don't have any fonts. We don't have any religious architecture around us. What we have in this production is just a simple rill of water that goes through the stage, and it is picked up and it is put upon his brow. And this, in many ways, I think, is in the spirit of Wagner, who he wanted us to really sort of understand the real essence and the real guts and grit of spirituality, rather than the sort of the institutionalizing and in some ways sort of the glorifying and therefore violating it that is characteristic of established religion in his mind. Here we have that moment of baptism.
Salbtest mir die Füße, das Haupt nun salbet die, du Reichsgenoss, das heute noch als König mich ist. Es uns verhießen, so segne ich dein Haupt, als König dich zu grüßen.
Parsifal has reached the height of sublimity. The trumpet calls suggest royalty, that he has a divine power. But this production, just seeing here, and I think probably ideally in Wagner's mind as well, this production should resist gaudy spectacle, and certainly the spectacle of power. And what is that power? Well, it's a power that is demonstrated as Parsifal comes on ultimately to cure, to heal Amfortas, and to save the Brotherhood. The perfect fool arrives. He was made wise by compassion. If all of us understand what he did, and maybe even if we try to do it ourselves, maybe we too will be able to turn the articles of, or the instruments of war into the instruments of healing. Actually, Parsifal doesn't ultimately preach a message, but I think it provides us with the vision of an ideal universe defined by the music. And this is the last time I'm going to be talking about Parsifal in this series. And when I was driving back to Santa Barbara this morning from San Francisco, I kept on thinking about what I was saying. I kept on thinking about this last scene. And I suddenly said to myself, would Wagner have been totally happy with this? Will we be fully happy with the elevation of this one individual to such a high position? And you know, we wouldn't be. It is, in fact, we could say that we view the ending of the opera from both a positive and perhaps a negative point of view, because power can destroy as much as it can nurture. But this is something that Wagner, and indeed the whole chorus, the whole performance, knows, because at the end, when we have all this glorious music so playing, up above, we hear a chorus of boys, of youths and knights singing höchstes heiles Wunder, erlösen dem Erlöser, which means it means a miracle of supreme salvation, redemption to our Redeemer. And I think that we can take this as a strange sort of message by saying that in fact even redeemers have to be redeemed. And that is perhaps a danger that lies in Parsifal's future. Thank you very much for your attention. I really enjoyed speaking to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Simon. That was fascinating. You always do such a good job. I appreciate it. We have some great questions from the audience that I'm going to present to you, and everyone, please use the Q&A function at the bottom to submit your questions, and I'll just read them out. But first, which production were all of these videos from? It was really beautifully staged. The voices were fantastic.
Yeah, it was from the Met production of about 10 years ago with Jonas Kaufmann and René Papa. I actually had been quite tempted to play a recording to use the DVD of the production that was done in San Francisco 25 years ago. There's a very good DVD of it, of a production of it in Baden-Baden. And I like it. I loved it. I love the interpretation. It's very grim and gritty. But the reason I didn't is the ending is different. And why I loved the ending of Nicholas Lanehoff's Parsifal here in San Francisco, I really felt that I had to, seeing I was asked to almost represent the opera house and present the opera to people, that it was that I should really give a good idea of what Wagner wrote, not sort of what Lanehoff added to it. But Lanehoff gave a marvelous version where Parsifal and Kundry fall in love, and they go out and they follow that railway line that clearly was leading to Auschwitz, but they weren't going out to oppress the world. They were going out to have children and to regenerate it. I left the opera house very happy that night.
That sounds powerful. We got a question about whether or not there's any kind of feminist redemption possible for a plot like Parsifal.
Lanehoff gave it to us.
Yeah.
It's the one thing I have to say, it upsets me. It disturbs me. Kundry dying at the end. Lots of people say, maybe they're right, say, look, she's lived for 2,000 years. You know, she laughed at Christ when he was taking his cross to be crucified. And she was told she had to live forever, and that therefore, when eventually she dies, this is a relief from terrible pain. But that's okay. But on the symbolic level of the opera, I would actually like to see. I'd like to see her survive. This is something that is actually done quite frequently now, I understand. I have seen a number of productions of Parsifal in different parts of the world, and quite often the Kundry survives in one way or the other.
Yeah. Actually, maybe that's a good segue. Are there any productions of Parsifal that you've seen that have really stuck with you for a particular aspect that they included, or I mean, I guess you've already kind of spoken to that, but
yes, actually, the productions that have stuck with me have been, well, obviously, actually, I think the Met one is fabulously sung. But then also my next one, my next favorite, I've seen it many times, is actually the Lanehoff one. I did see one in Munich. It was done by Peter Konvichny, who's a very unconventional director, and for him, the Grail was Kundry. And you think, God, that's odd. And then you think about it for a bit, and it begins to make quite a bit of sense, because the greatest joy what Kundry has to offer. What you have to do is find the right, create the right circumstances so that whatever she has to offer fulfills her as well as
Yeah.
yourself. And anyway, that was interesting. He also had all the knights living at the roots of a great big tree that occupied the stage, and all the roots were dying because they were living around it. And so actually, it was sort of a quasi, a sort of environmental work as well.
Yeah.
But it was that one has stuck with me. There are, there were some rather strange things in it as well, but there always are in convictionary productions. But you just have to let them stage, and then you think about them afterwards. And most of the time, after a few months, sometimes you suddenly realize, oh, that's what he meant.
Yeah. I think there's actually going to be some parallels between what you've described about the tree and the new production that we're going to have on stage at
Yeah,
San Francisco
good.
Opera. Yeah.
Good. Yes. Is it? I've not found out very much about it because actually I prefer to, in some ways, just sort of talk about the way I see Parsifal.
Yeah.
But is it quite sort of nature oriented?
I think so. In a lot of the descriptions and imagery around the costumes and the set, there are trees. It's a rotating set. I think that they're going to be sort of iterating on this kind of like tree motif. And the costumes are very floral and very kind of foresty and woodsy.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
It's different from the grimness we often get. But I mean, it's one thing I hardly mentioned, but there was that Good Friday vision that he had, which I think indicates that a rejuvenated nature is what is really at the heart of Parsifal. And that rejuvenated nature is almost paralleled in human beings by the growth of compassionate relationships.
Yeah. We have another question I want to make sure we include.
Right.
Is not Gurneman's the real hero, being this sort of steady, dependable knight instead of Parsifal being sort of elevated in this way?
I don't think so. Um, he's a hero to the extent that he has most of the words. And actually, it must be an incredibly demanding role to give. Technically, certainly Parsifal is the hero, and it's quite common in not only in opera but also in drama that the hero who's at the center of the piece is not necessarily the character who's most prominent in the action. It's just the action sort of goes around him. I mean, just think of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. He's in sort of the conventional sense, but he is in a structural sense.
Yeah.
So you could say that Amfortas is the hero, and certainly if you're going to do a very modernist version, I think you could make Amfortas the central hero.
Yeah.
I don't worry too. Actually, even I write and I speak about heroes and everything. I don't actually, when I get to see an opera, worry about too much as the hero, because in many ways, everybody, of course, sort of contributes to what it is the opera is about, and so you have to consider all of them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, okay. I think maybe it's almost 7:30. I don't want to keep people, late into the evening. But thank you so much, Simon. I'm going to hand things off to Peggy for final announcements, but please come
Okay.
back next season.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Professor Williams. And Parsifal, if you can't get to the Opera House, there'll be a live stream November 2nd, Sunday, 1 p.m., and then it'll be recorded and you'll be able to see it for 2 days after that. And then hopefully we'll see all of you back on Friday, November 7th for The Monkey King, along with the librettist, David Henry Wang. Thank you and good night. Enjoy your Friday evening. Bye-bye.